Hello everyone and welcome back to another Don't You Guys Have Phones meme, otherwise known as a Warframe video. Woo! Finally, after a little bit of a hiatus where I went away and took a much needed break, we're back! And to start things off, we're going to be giving you a guide that you've all been waiting for. A Vauban guide. Vauban, oh Vauban. He's been that frame that's been around the block and then some, having been incepted way back when crowd control was the pivotal aspect and mechanic for keeping your team safe, and would often be the preferred route over just taking nuke frames. But over time, the meta's changed and developed into basically requiring nothing more than nuke frames for every mission you go into and try and murder things, so crowd control isn't really the necessity anymore. So more DPS-focused playstyles have kind of taken the shining light away from frames like Vauban, who up until recently used to be nothing more than just crowd control. But now, ladies and gentlemen, Vauban has had a rework, and all things considered, this is one of those kind of reworks that makes you go, DE seems to have two settings when it comes to reworking frames. They either change the tempo a la Neja, where they didn't change the kit, so to say, but more so made it where the flow had been made more smooth and the playstyle was more fluidical. Or they go for a more radical rework, where the kit itself is the focus, and Vauban seems to be that rare mid-between where both the kit and the smoothness of play have been touched up and brought into a modern light. Vauban still maintains his CC focus and utility-orientated nature, being able to lock down huge areas by focusing on range and duration, relying on the utility between his Bastille and his Vortex. Making use of those two abilities and synergizing them with his other parts of his kit allows him to maintain a rather large area of control, and the fact that his Vortex and Bastille are now the same ability really helps emphasize that level of synergy. But what has Vauban always lacked? What's Vauban always lacked to remain competitive with the current market of Warframe? Damage. That's right, he now has damage in the form of a massive orbital bombardment. And yes, it's usable indoors. Not to mention with a rework to all of his balls. So many balls. These balls now offering more in the way of team utility and, well, actual usefulness rather than just being a bouncy jump pad. So in short, Vauban is still the same old CC focused frame that he's always been, but now he can do some big damage, and he's going to feel a lot more comfortable to play. In short, you'll be mostly making use of your range and duration, but with the added element of damage, you're now going to be seeing some possibility of actually supporting a team damage-wise. Although, for some bizarre reason, the damage scaling of his orbital strike doesn't really scale tremendously well beyond level 100, you will find that the damage of orbital bombardment and in conjunction with his new augments will be more than suitable for most levels of missions you'll end up doing in the main scheme of Warframe. And of course, you'll still be hoisting people up and sucking people into a black hole of doom and then synergizing in with the AoE damage you'll have with your Tesla balls and your orbital strike alike. Vauban is obtained in one of the easiest ways possible. Nightwave. All of Vauban's pieces come from Nightwave rewards, requiring 25 Nightwave credits per piece, so make sure you save up those credits if you want all of them. Sometimes they do rotate through, so you might have to wait a week or two to get all of them, but you can just passively get them by playing the game, thankfully, so long as you do your Nightwave missions. And then Vauban Prime is vaulted. Well, not as of this video. As of this video, he's actually unvaulted for the next 2 or 3 months, so get hold of him if you can, whilst you can. Otherwise, he does get unvaulted somewhat frequently, so keep your eyes open for whether he's vaulted or not via a link in the description, which will show you all the vaulted frames. And now for the abilities, and as a disclaimer, I can't believe I actually have to do this thing because I got people complaining about this. Please remember this guide is a finite point in time, meaning in the future, if changes are going to hit, this guide might become outdated. So if there are changes made, please keep up to date with his wiki and check out any updates that are made. I might have to make another video if there are changes, but as we all know, DE likes changing things, so Vauban might even get another rework in the future. Starting with a passive called Dismantle. Essentially, this is one of the more nonchalant passives, and it kind of more plays to Vauban's sort of fluidity and themes. Essentially, Vauban deals 25% bonus damage to enemies that are incapacitated. So when something's affected by, say, I don't know, all the crowd control you have, you'll be dealing extra damage to them. That's what we call synergy, folks. The first ability, and the one that has been completely reworked, is now called Tesla Nervos. Something you'll notice quite quickly about Vauban is that he has a mild fascination with balls. And this is the first of his balls. Casting your one will throw a ball with a mind of its own. This ball will then travel and roll around, trying to seek out the nearest enemy within range. Or if there are no enemies within range, it'll follow you around instead. Once reaching an enemy, it will inflict 25 electric damage per second, dealing 150 electric damage to enemies within 6 meters. This acts as a form of additional crowd control, as it will have a 100% status chance, and can follow you along like a lost puppy, premeditatively being cast, so that if you do walk up to enemies, it will then premeditatively roll up to them instead. Although, admittedly, because it will scale based on the range and latch onto enemies based on your range, chances are it's not going to be following you along for that long. Now, holding down your one will channel the ability and turn Vauban into a majestic juggler, allowing you to juggle up to 4 of these balls, which then, once releasing, will allow you to cast all 4 of them. Something you'll notice is that this is not necessarily going to be that damaging in of itself, but through the use of augments and or the utility of your other abilities, it can deal some half-decent damage, but it's never going to scale tremendously high. The damage of this is scaled based on your power strength, and the duration it latches onto the enemies is also based on your duration. The range in which they can then choose to target enemies also then based on your ability range, as well as also the shock radius and the pylon they generate. More so than anything else, you're going to be utilizing this for crowd control, as it will then guarantee the shock value with 100% status. So kind of using this in conjunction with your other abilities is kind of nice, but it can also then clump up with some other of your new remastered kit as well. The new augment for this ability is called Tesla Bank. When a Nervos is launched and latched onto an enemy, it will convert that enemy from just an electric dealing pylon into an additional damage dealing pylon. When you shoot the person with the Nervos attached to them, that damage will then be converted and dealt to enemies within 8 meters of said target, really helping to compile the added damage that you can get. Admittedly, it's probably one of the lesser used augments here, but it's quite nice to help compile a bit of extra damage on top of what you can do, and really helps push the idea that Vauban is now used for more than just crowd control. Vauban's 2, in essence, is still the same. It's called Mine Layer. Vauban's got even more balls than just his Tesla balls. These are a range of 4 different balls that will have different abilities depending on which one you use. Tapping your ability key will then change between the different types of balls, and then holding your 2 will then cast said ability. As we can already see here, the first of the balls is called Tether. Yes, words are hard. Tether Coil. Tether Coil deploys on contact with an enemy or surface, sticking onto that first object it touches. Once stuck, the coil extends wires and inflicts 250 damage to the targets it sucks in, incapacitating and pulling up to 2 enemies within 20 meters of said coil. The second of these balls, and possibly the quote-unquote worst, is the Flechette Orb, which fires out nails at nearby enemies, dealing a decent amount of puncture damage. I mean, it's all right, especially if you're staying in one location and you want to just walk away and let it be a bit of a sentry turret dealing damage to enemies nearby. It's not going to do the most amount of damage, and it's not going to do the worst either. It's kind of one of those abilities it's decent to cast every now and again if you don't know what else to do, because it'll just do work for you whilst you're not paying attention. The damage does scale based on power strength, but again, the scaling's a bit weird, so you're never going to see a tremendous amount of damage out of this. But by the fact you can cast multiple of these at any given time, you can kind of ramp the damage up. The third of these pads is called a Vector Pad. And this, if you've ever played a racing game before, like, I don't know, Super Mario, you might recognize this. You put the ball down, and it puts arrows on the ground. By logic, you sort of get the idea that this is going to launch you in that general direction. This is more powerful the more power strength you have, so if you're running at the time, you'll get sent further. If you have more power strength, you'll get sent even further than that. The great thing about this, you can use this to ward areas because it will also do it to enemies as well. So if you're against a lot of melee-heavy units like Butchers or Infested, you can use this to keep the enemy at bay, or to hilariously launch enemies off the side of a cliff. The fourth and probably most useful of all of these new balls is Overdriver. This will latch onto nearby allies and give them a 25% damage bonus, which can be made stronger with power strength. And honestly, this is probably one of the most viable buffs you'll get out of him, and it is actually, in my eyes, viable enough for taking for Eidolons. Although you will need to mod for quite considerable amounts of power strength to make it worth using, but if nothing else, it's something you should always have active at any given time because, hey, 25% damage buff is a 25% damage buff, even with minimal power strength. And now for what you've all been waiting for. The new 3, which is Photon Strike. Yeet. Photon Strike is the new big cannon. Vauban sends out a targeting beacon and after 2 seconds will land a massive orbital strike that will blast the target area for 2,500 blast damage in a 5-meter radius. This damage then scales based on your power strength and the level of the enemy. So there's a default level of power scaling even without any power strength, and seeing as you're likely going to be modding range, you'll be hitting quite a large area with this. Admittedly, again, it's not going to scale tremendously well because of the way the equation of scaling works, but if nothing else, it's a pretty damn powerful ability that definitely gives Vauban the ability of actually being competitive against other damage frames, if not completely winning the mark on it. It will at least be good for low level missions. And the great thing about it is you can cast on the fly and it's a very fast cast. It's not tremendously expensive, and I keep falling off the edge because I'm an idiot. It's not a tremendously heavy cast, and they did trim the cast time for it after its initial release, so it is quite a fast ability. And you can spam this very, very fast over and over again to ramp up the damage. And the great thing is, it works really well in tandem with your other abilities as well to stack up enemies and then deal damage to all of the clumped up enemies you have with you. The augment for this is called Photon Repeater, and it is possibly the simplest of augments you'll get for Vauban. And it's kind of nice, especially if you just want to spam the crap out of your Photon Strike. So essentially, if Photon Strike hits 5 targets, then the next cast will cost no energy, which is cool, especially again if you want to just spam the ever-loving hell out of it and you're fighting against very clumped up enemies, which most of your enemies probably will be due to the fact of your crowd control and the way it clumps enemies up. Now, you might be wondering where Vortex has gotten to. Well, nowadays, Vortex and Bastille are the same ability. Your 4 is still titled as Bastille, but it's now also Vortex as well, and I'll explain why. So if you're used to the old version of these abilities, it's basically the same as they were individually, but now they're just the same in one button. The way this works is now by tapping your 4, you will use your Bastille. By holding your 4, it will then activate the Vortex, basically converting it from Bastille into Vortex, adding that lovely ability of synergy. The Bastille, as always, will lift enemies up in a 10-meter radius and start reducing their armor by 10% per second the enemy is lifted for, which is a great added element of support, which will be put into your compositional value, as not only do you now have crowd control, but having the ability of stripping armor for every second the enemy is in a Bastille is going to be extremely useful. Additionally, allies within the field of the Bastille will now additionally gain a 1,000 armor buff that will stack up the longer they're stood in the field. It will start at a small amount and then build up the longer they're stood in. So the bigger your Bastille, the more of a safe area you'll have. So you're stripping armor, you're giving armor to your team, and you give safety of crowd control, which is really nice. So it's kind of what it used to be, but much, much more efficient and much more potent. Once the duration of the Bastille wears off, it will default into a vortex, meaning you don't even need to press the button for it to do its job, really. And it will then suck all the enemies into the center radius of the Bastille and basically cause the weirdest man pile you'll ever see. Damage will be dealt during this process, and the duration of the vortex is then based on the duration that you cast. Keeping in mind, you can manually cast your vortex as well by holding your 4 from the word go, and then the vortex will be automatically cast. Keeping in mind that if you allow the vortex to wear off, the duration of the vortex is not going to be that long, but if you cast the vortex from the word go, the full duration of the vortex will be lasting instead. So, of course, this means you're lining yourself up for success. So if you use the Vortex, then line up yourself with a Photon Strike right afterwards, surprise, surprise, the enemy are going to take an absolute metric crap ton of damage. Additionally, this does also then allow you to strip armor to allow them to take even more damage as well. Or maybe you want to use your Bastille to hold off an area, you can then selectively pick off targets as you go. Or maybe you pick them up with a Bastille, and then you put down a... One of your lovely little, where are they? The tether coils, for example. Either way, your Bastille and Vortex should be a great setup mechanic to set up either lots of damage or additional crowd control, or to just hold down an area. Of course, the range in which your Bastille and Vortex will hit is based on your ability range, and the duration of the Bastille and the duration of the Vortex is based on your ability duration. The damage over time and the stripping potency and the armor value increase is also based on your power strength. However, you cannot go above 1,000 armor in the buff value. Probably the most comical of these augments is called Repelling Bastille. Enemies within the Bastille have a 100% chance to be repelled every 4 seconds. Vortex additionally has its duration increased by 70% of its maximum duration for each additional Vortex thrown. So there's a bit of added synergy, but there's also a bit of hilarity in watching enemies be thrown away every time they try and make their way up to the Bastille. And it just helps reinforce the element of security that your Bastille will make, although you do have to keep in mind it's not necessarily the most important thing to use. And realistically, is it worth using this augment where you could have just used more range or duration, possibly? Personal preference, it's just a funny augment nonetheless. And last but not least, as with all these videos, we have a build segment. Keep in mind, this is all down to personal preference. I'm just showing you what's worked for me. Try to use some intuitiveness and cunning when it comes to making your own builds. Don't try and use cookie cutters because that's just boring. But use what works for you. I just like to give you an idea as to what worked for me. So starting off with this first build, this is a general CC build that does half decent damage as well. You're going to start with an aura mod of personal choice. I go corrosive projection or energy siphon because energy siphon will be good because you're caster heavy. Then we're going to be basing ourselves with a lot of range with overextended, stretch, and cunning drift. We then have efficiency from streamline because we're going to be casting like mad. You could, in theory, put in fleeting expertise here as well, but you want a lot of duration, so, you know, minus duration with fleeting expertise ain't too good. You then have some survivability with vitality, and then subjectively you can either put adaptation if you have it, or any of the other survivability mods. Vauban is a very bit glass cannon type frame where he's very flimsy without some survivability, so you want at least something in there to help keep him alive more. Otherwise you will find yourself randomly getting one shot. Then you have flow, whether prime flow or regular flow is up to you, as you are going to be casting a lot and you want that energy pool to pull from. And then you have continuity for that added bit of extra duration. There are some other builds that we could go into, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to stick with that default build and a new player-friendly build like this. Again, you've got all the baseline mods of Intensify, Flow, Continuity, and Streamline. Weird enough, even though Vauban focuses on crowd control with range and duration, you can play him in a very versatile fashion now, especially with his rework. So even with minimal power strength, most of your abilities will still deal consistent damage at low levels, and again, because Photon Strike scales regardless of power strength, you actually deal good damage with that even with minimal power strength. So most of the time you're focusing on range and duration with Vauban. And if you want to go damage, you would sort of just replace things out with a bit more power strength, but most of Vauban's abilities don't necessarily scale too well with that, so it's never really going to be something you focus on unless you're going for a really powerful solo build. But that might be something we're looking into in a separate video in of itself. And that's the video. I'm not gonna lie, this video was a tough one to record. Having been away from making videos for almost a week, this was a toughie. I'm sure most of you have probably noticed that there was a slight lack in quality in this. But hey, we're getting back on the bandwagon, and hey, there's gonna be a lot of new things coming soon. We're gonna be doing some analytical videos. We're gonna be doing some more guides. There's a Grendel guide coming soon, even though I find him dull as hell. But hey, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, do make sure you leave a like, share, and subscribe to your friends. That's how that goes. Make sure you join us on Twitch as well. There'll be a link down in the description. If you want to join our fellow Chroma and Vauban here, I record these on Twitch so that we can get you guys involved, to get your feedback and help you influence how these videos end up being made. So it'd be great to get you guys coming joining us, as we do stream every single day, generally speaking. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch all of you Tom Hatters in the next video. Hopefully the next one won't be quite so shocking. Ta-ra! Now I'm going to go play my balls.